So I guess you guys get the intimate lecture today, since we've got about half of you here today. It is what it is. I guess everybody decided today was the right day to take off or something. I don't know. I missed that memo. Maybe I should have taken the day off too. Today we're going to, by the way, you guys got a second copy of the assignment handout. It's exactly the same except the dates are correct. And you guys probably already saw that. So it's saying that it's March 7th, not May 7th. So my mistake on the last one, it's correct now. That's why you got the replacement handout for it, because I wanted to try to be accurate. Today we're going to do a little bit more advanced InDesign work during the demo period and what you guys will be working on for your exercise 111. But before we do that, I'm going to talk through a lot more about graphic design and a lot more about structure and organization and what graphic design is and how do we lay things out and that sort of part of the puzzle. So from here, we're going to spend today doing that kind of graphic design. You guys obviously are going to do a precursor. If you read exercise 111, you're going to do a precursor to the poster, the lecture series, something kind of similar today to get you working on it. Next class, next Monday, you will actually get your final for this class. So it starts Monday and ends on the final, and that is your portfolio. I will also spend a bunch of time talking through portfolio layouts, and we'll look at a bunch of portfolios and that sort of thing. So Monday's a bit of a departure from the poster that you're working on today and that you'll be working on. So I'm just kind of giving you that warning. We'll be working in books a little bit more on Monday, but it'll give you a good sense of graphic design as well. So today's about structure and organization in graphic design. And I'm going to start first by talking about grid systems. And grid systems are something that applies to graphic design, certainly, but it's also more than just graphic design. We could use grid systems to design a building. We could use a grid system to design a landscape. So there's a lot that we can adapt this into. But obviously today we're going to be talking specifically in terms of graphic design. So we'll start with some of the major terms. Some of these are obvious, some of them not so obvious. The first one is margins. You're probably already familiar with margins. By default, your Word document that you type for your English paper or your history paper has margins. They show up by default. They essentially define the active area of the page. They're the border around your page that you put your content inside. And so that margin can be really big, or it can be very small. It depends on the end content. And the purpose of it is really to say, here's where the stuff is that you're going to focus on. Everything outside of the margin you're not going to focus on. Here's the content I want you to look at. They're going to vary depending on the format, and they can contain some content. So we talk about the margin as a way of focusing your attention on the primary content, but we could have a page number or a little footnote or something that would show up in the margin that wouldn't be unusual, certainly. So our margins here, I highlighted in blue. It's the area around the page. Then we move into columns. Again, something you're fairly familiar with. If you've read a magazine or you've read a newspaper, you've read a column before. The idea here is that it's a short bit of text or images that's used vertically to align visual elements. You could have multiple columns. So you could have 2, 3, 4 columns across the page. You could see them right there with the arrows on them. And the widths are going to vary depending on the function of the design. Technically speaking, your English paper or your history paper is a column layout. It's just one column, one big column of text. If we were writing a newspaper or a magazine, we'd be using multiple columns. So if we looked at it on this same diagram here, you could see them filling in with blue. Those are the columns. So we have the margins around the outside, and we have the columns dividing up the inside. Then we get to something called column intervals. These are the spaces between columns. If you imagine for a second picking up your favorite magazine, and if there was no division between the columns, it would be really hard to read. So this is absolutely necessary. If you're going to have multiple columns, you need that space in between the columns to say, here's the end of one line, here's the next column. So we need to have that space. It's called a column interval. It could also be called a gutter width, depending on who's talking about it. They're inactive negative spaces that essentially separate one column from the next column. So inactive negative spaces, they prevent things from colliding together. Otherwise, we'd end up with a jumble of words and or images. So here we are with our column intervals in between the columns. Next thing, we're moving into the realm where you might not know these terms, is something called a flow line. Essentially, a flow line supports the vertical columns by adding one or more horizontal lines across that divide the page into horizontal sections. So you might have a top section and a bottom section, and then you have the columns. They provide an additional alignment point for your graphic layout. And you'll see that the best, and I'm showing here kind of a portfolio style piece, the best layouts have these flow lines built into them. When we look at the portfolio lecture next class, and I go through and show you a bunch of samples, the best ones have good solid flow lines. Think also rule of thirds. It's a good place to put the flow line. Hint, hint. So here, the flow lines could be in any one of these locations. They could be in all of the locations. It depends on the layout. Generally speaking, it's toward the top, but it doesn't have to be. Grid modules are the spatial areas that divide up the visual and text pieces of the page. The number of modules vary. Apparently, I can't talk anymore. Yeah.
Sure. About the flow lines.
Uh-huh.
Are they all the same for each page, or like whole book here? They have the one flow line.
So the best, and it will help when I show you a bunch of examples. When we look at the portfolios, it'll be a little bit more clear. But the best bodies of work are consistent with the column intervals or the columns and the flow line. So let's say you did a design and your flow line is always at a third of the way down or a quarter of the way down across all the pages. If that follows through with the whole book, even if the grids vary, even if the content varies, there'll be one element that ties all the pages together, and it'll feel like a body of work that belongs together. If the flow line moves, if it goes up, if it goes down, if it changes, it won't feel as much like a body of work. It'll feel more sporadic. So essentially, the grid modules are the divisions of the columns by the flow lines. So we get these little boxes. If I filled them all in, you wouldn't be able to see them because they'd all turn blue. But essentially, these pieces, let me draw on top of it. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be, you get the idea. Each one of these little squares is one of these grid modules that I'm talking about. So here it is in a graphic layout sense, where they're using these grid modules to support the content of the design. Notice, though, that they do break the grid in certain places. So in this particular example here, we have, this is a very obvious, there's one of our grid modules, there's another grid module, there's a grid module. But then this text spans 2 modules. This text here spans 2 modules. So you can always break what you've established. This is just the baseline. And it's important for you guys to know that and to see that. So working with basic grids. Our grids are designed to unify and order the compositional space. So we have some fundamental backbone that we can lay our content on in the first place. It should be apparent without being obvious. So you don't need to actually put in, grid lines and see those grid lines. It should just help you organize and frame your work. It should help you compose the visual elements together to balance, create contrast, or create the shape of the page. What does that page feel like? You want to avoid an arbitrary grid. So I'm telling you all this stuff about grids, 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 grids. We need a grid. We need that underlying structure. The worst thing you can do is throw a grid on there because I say you have to have a grid. You want to think about why the grid should be there. What is an appropriate size of grid, and how does that help form your work in the first place? How does that help your layout? Not just, I'm going to throw some lines on the page and call it a day. It should be based on the page format and the complexity of what you're trying to present. For example, I bring up that English paper over and over again. And I like the English paper because you're very unlikely to include images in your English paper. If I say history paper, you might have to include a few images. So English paper is like just text. So that is a really simple layout. It's a simple page format. So your underlying grid doesn't have to be very complicated to lay that out. You have your margins, you have your active area of the page, that's it. If we start to add in more content, if we do the history paper instead, we have a lot of text, but we also have images. So how do those images start to align? What are the sizes of those images? How appropriate? Is it a large image? Is it a small image? Those kinds of things will help define what this grid is. So we could come up with this list. We just sat here and brainstormed a bit. Functions of grid: control, organization, rhythm, harmony, unity, readability, balance, direction, those kinds of things. Could provide contrast, etc. So the most basic grid is that single column. Perfect for large amounts of text. This is your English paper. I couldn't just throw an English paper up there. I had to do one with some kind of a colored background. But you get the idea. Big body of text. You will often need to adjust those margins a little bit, especially if you're writing for a book facing pages rather than just a single set of sheets. Here's our book layout. Sides in the bottom tend to be large. The top is usually a little bit smaller. The inner margin is usually half the width of the outer margin, though you have to be careful of the binding and not lose content in the binding, depending on the binding type that you're doing. And the positions are mirrored across the spread. So here's our example, and it's essentially one side is mirrored to the other side. The margin side on one side matches the margin side on the other side. Oh, I enlarged it so you could see it. So this margin right here is going to be the same as this margin right here. This margin here is going to be the same as that margin there. Consistent top, consistent bottom. Notice that the page numbers appear in the margin space. So that's a subordinate element that's included in the margin space. Remember the rule of thirds. So we talk all about these grids and this layout and all the rest of it, but those compositional techniques that we talked about in Photoshop way back when still apply. If we use those compositional photographic techniques here, it will help inform your design layout as well. So a lot of the examples that I'm going to start showing are lecture series examples. They're not necessarily an architecture lecture series poster, but they're posters. And the reason that I'm showing them is to try to get you thinking about your poster. So we'll go through and analyze a bunch of them as I go through. Multiple column grids contain several spatial intervals. So we're talking about lots of columns here. They're basically nearly endless in terms of you can add more and more columns. You can add more and more flow lines. They're suitable for complex projects. You can create movement, drama, rhythm, etc. So as we look at this poster a little bit larger, let's identify some of the key elements on this poster. So we have a column here. Oops, that was not what I wanted. We have a column here of negative space. We have a column, come on, there. We have a column here, we have a column here, and we have a column here. Make sense? We have a really nice flow line that goes right across there. So in this particular example, we don't really have grid modules because they're just columns. We have our column intervals, the space in between, our gutter widths right there. Those are space in between the columns. Modular grids are extensions of these multiple column grids with the addition of horizontal flow lines. That last poster had one flow line. You could have multiple flow lines, i.e. this image here. The end page ends up being divided into these little blocks. Be aware that you can combine those blocks together to create larger images. When we're determining the size of our modules, so how big this should be, there's a few things that we want to think about. Number one, if it's going to be filled with text, how long should a line be of text? So if, for example, I had 12-point font and I was projecting it on this screen and it was little itty bitty, and the sentence, my English paper started right here and it went all the way across here to the end of the page, right? And it was 12-point, little itty bitty font. That would be really awkward to read because I'd be saying, okay, well, I'm going to read this English paper and I start here and I'd have to keep moving. It would be really awkward because it would be too long. So when you're thinking about your content, obviously this is an absurd example. You wouldn't write your English paper that way. But you want to think about what is an appropriate line length for that text. How long can you be reading before you're having to move the page to read? So what's an appropriate line length? What's the smallest size of a photograph that's appropriate? How small is too small? On a computer screen, it's easy to zoom in. We can blow up a photograph, we can see it much larger. But when it gets printed out, if it's an inch, let's say you had a photograph and it was 1 inch by 1 inch. That was your module. Is that a little small for that photograph? Probably. You're not going to be able to see anything in that photograph. So you need to be aware of what's the smallest size of an image. Usually they're similar. The line length of a paragraph that you're reading and the maximum or the minimum size of an image is usually close. In each case, if you needed more space, you could expand. If your column of text was a certain size and you needed more space for the image, you could use 2 columns for the image, for example. So you can always span it. Here's some example layouts. And I'm not saying these are all right. Actually, I have some gripes about some of the spacing in between certain images, but it gives you kind of an idea of how you can start to lay these things out. And you can see where there are flow lines. I might make some adjustments to them, but you can see where there's a horizontal and a vertical flow line and how they're combined together. When you have a module, a grid module, you have compositional flexibility. You can always choose to break the modules. You can add the modules together. You can get more out of your particular layout, but it's a good backbone. Then we get into alternative grids. These are not so strict. We don't have our columns divided by our flow lines. In this case, they're more organic. They're loose. They rely heavily on intuitive placement of objects, what feels right, that intuition part that I talked about 2 classes ago. So if you're going to do this kind of a layout, there's nothing wrong with it. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you need to be aware of other compositional factors. The rule of thirds, for example, where things fall. If you look at this example image right here, there's your rule of thirds, right? This logo is falling on that rule of thirds line. Those kinds of things become really important, but they're based on your intuition, your judgment as a graphic designer. It's much harder than just a basic grid and following that basic grid. Show a few more examples so you can start to see it. Visual elements on the page define the page. So you're using the composition of these elements to define what's happening on the page and where you're supposed to look when you look at a particular page. The compositional structure is often based on a dominant visual element or focal point. So this is a particularly challenging poster to think about. Does it have columns? Not really. Maybe a little bit on the right side. You know, we might be able to say, yeah, this is kind of a column right in here. Maybe. But certainly everything over here is not a column. So in this context, what then starts to become the dominant area of this page? What do you look at first? So look away for a second, daydream out the window, and then look right at the page. What do you jump to? What's the thing that you focus on? I'm curious. It varies person to person. What do you think, Boris? The fracture line? Okay, so we talked about, in the photography section, we talked about strong diagonals, right? So you could argue that that is a pretty strong diagonal and that's a pretty strong diagonal, for example. So you saw those. Anybody see something different? Anybody willing to admit that they saw something different? Okay, I agree. I agree that the strong diagonal. I think this box is also kind of strikingly in your face. It's out there. So the combination of the fracture, these diagonals, they've got a few of these planes in the background helping you out too. The composition of this to this is starting to get you into this particular poster. So it doesn't really matter that it's design, architecture, art, and planning. We kind of get that. We can glean that really quickly. But right in here, after we get directed into this point, there it is, exhibition, fashion show. So the elements on the page are leading us to what is this about? So it's not based on a grid system anymore. It's not based on hierarchy. It's based on the elements on the page lead us into this is what it's about, the exhibition and fashion show. And then you can read subordinate information from there about the times and the dates and all the rest of it. So it's those elements on the page that are acting not in a grid, but in a guide for your eye as you start to investigate the page. Another example here of an alternative grid. This works out. It looks like a really nice design when it comes together, but it's much harder to do this and to set it up. I think one of the other challenges when people do this kind of text is that you end up with these awkward places where the text gets really squished and funny to read, like right up there. It's a really awkward place to read the text. I think the text is far more successful in this lower page where there are two blocks of text. One side is even, the other side is a little bit ragged. That, I think, works a little bit better as part of this. But look at this as a set of pages. These are, by the way, spreads, so the fold of the page would be occurring right here as you open the book. And as we look at this as one page followed by another page, there's some similar elements. This diagonal line here is similar to that diagonal line there. So these pieces of the page, that diagonal and that diagonal, are trying to be similar. There's a flow line that's established right here. That same flow line occurs right there. So there's a consistency. Even though it's an organic grid, even though it's not the traditional rectilinear setup, the same concepts still apply. We're using the same elements over and over on the page. We're using the same flow line on the page. Breaking the grid. So grids, whether they're the organic grid or whether they're the strict compositional grid that we talked about in the beginning with grid modules, they're always a base, but don't be afraid to intelligently break the grid. In the world of architecture, we talk a lot about a column grid, for example. That's something that appears structurally in a building frequently. We have a set of columns. There's a certain interval to those columns. There's a certain rhythm to those columns. And you'll find that if you suddenly remove one column, or you take something out of that grid, it provides a very different space. That's where people gather because it's the open space. It's the missing piece. Same thing happens in your graphic design. If you intelligently break the grid, if you intelligently say, this isn't going to be one grid module, it's going to be 4, it's going to draw emphasis to that break. That being said, if you break it too often, it's probably not the right grid. So generally follow the framework, but don't be afraid to break it as necessary. The interaction of visual elements. Developing a hierarchy. Hierarchy helps a lot in establishing a clear focal point to your design. You want that attraction for your eye. It's the thing that you look at first as part of, in this case, a poster, or as part of a page. Then there's the subordinate visual elements that are a little bit smaller. So if you establish the primary element and then you do sub-elements from there, you bring somebody into the page and you get them interested in what you're talking about. You're leading through the viewer through a logical and meaningful journey. If a hierarchy is not established, your eye gets scattered, you get overloaded, and you move on. And you've probably had this happen before, where you look at something, it's too busy, and you're like, no, I don't want to spend time on this. You get distracted, you move on. So you as a graphic designer want to think carefully about what leaps out at you. So here's another example of a poster. And as you were looking at this, what do you see first? National Portfolio Day. I agree. That's the thing that stands out most. So that's hierarchy number 1. That's at the top. So then from there, we move on. So there's number 1. Then we move on, and it might be the yellow elements. So it might be that it's Saturday, January 19th. It might be that it's California College of the Arts. Those two are kind of the next level. Then we move in a little bit further, and maybe we read whatever's happening here. I can't even read it. Once we read that, maybe we move in, we start to read this. Once we've read that, maybe we say, OK, well, now I really want to investigate this, and I want to look at what all those things are written sideways. You don't start at the back of the room and look at the things that are sideways. It's not how your brain works. You look at that thing that jumps out at you. So this designer has established a really strong hierarchy that grabs your attention first, brings you in a little bit closer, you see more detail. Brings you in a little bit closer, you see more detail. That's what I'm talking about with this hierarchical development. Good rule of thumb, 12-6-3-1. Think multiple scales to help establish the hierarchy. So let's say, for example, we're looking, I'm going to just skip to the next slide. Okay, let's say I'm standing in the very back of the room with you guys in the back of the room. As I look at this poster, what jumps out? Same thing, National Portfolio Day stands out. And I'm way back here at the back of the room. In my rules, it would be 12 feet away. I'm more than that from here. And as I step forward, I should start to see the next elements appear. So maybe I start to say, OK, well, it's Saturday, January 15th, 2005. And I keep working my way forward. So I've gotten from 12 feet to 6 feet. And I'm exaggerating that as I'm walking through you guys here. OK, I have more information. Let me get into the 3 feet. Maybe I'm starting to read some of this smaller text down here. I walk in a little bit closer. I'm seeing closer elements. And by the time I get to 1 foot away, I'm seeing something that I haven't seen yet. If you think of this in the same context of your architectural design, you're doing a presentation on the wall, a big poster. You're sitting in front of the review panel. They're seeing it from a certain distance. They're seeing it maybe from 12 feet away, maybe from 6 feet away. But you'll also notice that people, the reviewers, tend to get up and look at something a little bit closer. You've noticed that before, right? They tend to get up, and before long, they're standing 1 foot away from your drawing. They should be seeing something different when they're at 1 foot away from your drawing from when they're at 12 feet. You want to design for all of that distance. You want to think about that as you're creating your poster. If you've established that hierarchy and you've created interest, you will draw people in to wanting to look at your poster or your book or whatever it is. Start by ranking elements by importance. So you're doing a poster for the National Portfolio Day. What's the most important thing? Maybe it's National Portfolio Day. Then what's the next thing? What's the next subordinate element? Place the dominant or the highest ranking visual elements in the foreground. They're the biggest, they draw your attention. Place the lower ranking elements further away, smaller. Compositional factors, we could go through all of that list. That's a lot of what we've already talked about. Space. This is the other piece of it. Space provides that contrast for the active elements of the page. If you have everything crammed together and you have no breathing room around it, you've heard people talk about there's no breathing space around this element. If there's no breathing room around it, you can't appreciate that element. You can't understand what it's like to be that element. It's kind of like, let's say we walked into St. Peter's Cathedral, for example, and you were the only person in the entire building. That would feel totally different than if you were in a crowd with 150,000 people crammed right next to each other. You would have a very different feeling of what the space is like. Same thing happens here. How much space is appropriate around your visual elements? The empty space is what brings your elements alive. If you focus on the negative space, you'll get better, more quality active space. Space is imperative for your eye. It gives you the room for your eye to wander. It gives you the clues for where you're supposed to look in a particular image. It also gives you the clue for where you're supposed to stop looking and move on to something else. So if I look at this example, do I have that as a larger? No. So if I look at this page here, what's the dominant element of this page? We're just ranking those visual pieces. I think the dominant element is that negative space right there. It's right there in the center. It's the opposite of what you think it is, but that tells your brain this is where I'm supposed to start. And if you look away and you look back, chances are you'll focus on that part first. You'll realize that this says masterpieces, and then you'll end up back up here into whatever this photographic thing is going on. So it's an interesting trick that the designer is creating here with that blank negative space right in the center of this particular composition. If you group elements together with space around them, you're going to provide a focal point naturally. This is the spot that I'm supposed to look. If you center an object, it's going to equalize the space around it and negate all the space around it, making it relatively ineffective. That's why centering doesn't always work. If you place something off-center, i.e. rule of thirds, you create a weighted asymmetrical composition, which can be a very strong way of activating the space around. And don't have too much space around a particular object. So here I just have a blank page. And if I was going to draw on this page, and I started by saying, OK, great, I have this page. Here's my element. There's too much space around it. It doesn't work. It's also right in the center. OK, so I need a bigger object. OK, well, it's there. There's a lot of space around it. If instead I take that object and I move it right here, that already feels better, doesn't it? So I've got more space on these sides and less space over here. So it's activating. There's my rule of thirds, roughly. This is all what I'm talking about. It's activating this space versus the back side. So it really changes the composition just by moving it off center. And it doesn't have to be on a rule of thirds where I'm down at the bottom third and the left third here. I could instead put it right here to activate the space. That would work. I'm still giving myself more space on all these sides. That would be fine. It could be in the upper corner here. So you've got flexibility in terms of where it goes, but you want to think about that. Space can be used to establish the hierarchy. That space can really help focus your attention. The space around the dancer and that title really focuses your attention on that title in this particular poster. Use consistency and progression when changing scale. Quantity. This is a big one. Too many things, you get visual clutter, disorder. Too few things, you get something that's not very exciting to look at. So you have to figure out what is that right balance. What gives you just the right amount of content? Not too much, not too little. And how do you go about doing that? Well, number one, you want to make sure everything you put on the page has a function. There's a reason it belongs on the page. Then you can use the subtractive or additive method to determine how much is too much on a particular page. Different people do it differently. So in terms of subtractive, what I mean is, here's all the things that I want to put on the page. I throw them all on the page, and then I start to remove things. Oh, it's too cluttered. Let me take something away. That's a little better. Let me take this away. That's a little better. Let me take this away. Well, now it's too simple. I need that element back. Let me put it back in. The additive method, I start with a blank canvas, and I put one thing on the page. Is that enough? Nope, not quite. Let me put the second thing on the page. Not quite. Put the third thing on the page. Yep, that's right. So additive is blank page adding things to it. Subtractive is put everything on the page and take away. And it just kind of depends on how your brain works as to which one of those you're going to use. Orientation and position are critical. They can lead to strong contrast that enhance the hierarchy. So if, for example, all the elements are oriented horizontally, and then there's one vertical element, guess what? That cross between the vertical and the horizontal becomes the focal point. Don't forget about diagonals here. I really like this particular poster. I think it's a really good example of using horizontal versus vertical elements. So as we look at this, all the text, right, an idealist, I am a true, a visionary, a believer, a creator, they're all strongly horizontal elements. Then we have this one critical vertical line. That happens to be the mirror line for the text too. And it drives you right into this point. And when you do that, let me erase all my scribbles. I am a true dreamer becomes the key element. And you focus right there as how you interact with this piece. And then you read around from that. So it's the intersection of the horizontal and the vertical that are providing that focal point that you start from in that particular piece. Depth, dimension, and perspective. So everything we've shown so far and everything we've done so far has all been flat. Elements arranged on a particular page. You can use elements going back in perspective, so one in front of the other, to also create composition. So this is kind of more of a compositional technique, certainly. You're moving away from the flat, you're stacking your elements in space, and that's then providing that additional depth. You can layer elements to say this is more important because it's in front, these are further away, and therefore they're behind. Typography. We spent a whole lecture last class talking about type. Guess what? It applies. Don't forget to pay careful attention to what fonts you're choosing to use, how big they are, what their scale is, how bold they are, all those kinds of questions. Are they serif? Are they sans serif? All the stuff we talked about last class. They're as important as the other visual elements on the page. They're as important as a photograph. Think macro and micro scales, the big picture stuff and the small picture stuff. Color. Color provides visual emphasis. It emphasizes something specific. You can use it as a key. Everything is black and white except for this one element that's red. What does your eye naturally go to? It goes to the red element versus everything else. So you can be very careful about how you use the color and how you draw somebody into a particular page. You can use a comprehensive color palette, or you can just use one color. All it takes is one color. When we were doing thesis at Berkeley, one of the big things when I was going through thesis is there was a transition between the people that were doing the big color, beautiful renderings on glossy paper and those of us that were doing not really hand drawings, but more hand drawing style graphics. So we'd have drawings that had lots of line weights and stuff. They were black and white, and there was kind of a competition between the two groups. And my thesis group was the group that was doing more of the old school drawing. Let's call it old school because it wasn't really hand drawing. My group was doing that, and the other group was doing the big color renderings, which is kind of interesting because here I am teaching you about color renderings and all the rest of it. But I was in that group. I wasn't in the color rendering group. I was in the other group. And one of the things that we chose to do is we all sat down and we picked what was going to be our highlight color. So in my thesis, everything was black and white except for a little bit of red. And I was very careful about where I applied the red so that I would draw people's attention to certain pieces. It was very carefully controlled. You can do that using this color. We will talk at length about color theory and what certain colors mean and why you choose to use one color versus another color. That's for another lecture. Consider the tone of the design with regard to the colors used. Is it appropriate to use the particular color that you want to use? Graphic shapes, linear elements. These are the layout techniques that sometimes get employed early on in the portfolio design process. And I'm going to caution you here that they're often overdone. You really don't need as many of these as you think. They are the little plus signs. They're the little underline. They're the little extra lines. And before you know it, people end up with portfolio pages. Like if I was doing a portfolio page, there's my portfolio page. Oh, I'll add a line here, I'll add a line there, let me put a little plus over here in the corner, I'll put a little circle over here, and before you know it, there's just too many things going on the page. That's for editing. We need to get rid of those things. But they can be very clear ways of directing somebody towards certain content. If instead I took that portfolio page and I had one line across the top, everything above the line was title, block, extra information, everything below it was content, that could work fine. So you want to think about what's appropriate and not overdo it. So in review, you as the designer need to create some kind of visual hierarchy in your design. Could be in graphic elements, could be just in type. The size and shape of the type, the font used, etc. You control and order the design. What does somebody look at first? What do they look at second? What do they look at third? Use contrast to establish focal areas. Everything's horizontal, there's one vertical, that's where I start looking. Use compositional factors to support your design. Rule of thirds, diagonals, those kinds of things. So here's an example of a portfolio style book. And I'm going to show you a whole bunch more portfolios next class. But here we are. We've established in this particular image, there's a bunch of columns. So we've got 4 columns. we have a flow line that runs across the top of the page, and we have an image that spans 3 of the 4 columns. As we go to the next page, you see that that flow line stays consistent. The yellow underneath identifies it. We've got a lot of text, so it's a single column layout here. A little bit different. As we move forward, we have consistency across the page. The flow line is moved down, but this page registers across. The text relates to the image on the other side. So it's a variant on the same design process. Here we come back, we have the same flow line at the top. So there's a consistency page to page, and that's really, really important. The column of text here spans 2 columns because they need a little bit more space as part of it. Another example. OK, so we're going to take a quick break. What have we got? We'll come back at 9:01, and we'll start with some InDesign, and I'll talk you through some of the more complex strategies of how you place your images, etc. OK? OK, so we're going to start back up with exercise 111. And my purpose today is to kind of throw a bunch of different things at you so that you can see some of the more advanced techniques in InDesign in terms of how we frame and place objects, etc. So what I'm doing today isn't necessarily something where you have to do it all when you're doing a given project. I'm just trying to show you a bunch of different things so that you're more prepared and you get some ideas going forward. So for our purposes today, we're going to do a little postcard about the architecture program here. If you're an industrial design student and are in this class and want to do a little postcard about the industrial design program, that's OK with me too. So it's because I know there's some of you in that. But if you're in the architecture program, do it about architecture. If you want to do it about DVC in general, that's OK. The content doesn't really matter. This is about the learning process more than anything else. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new document, which we've done before. And rather than having a letter size page, I'm going to do a width and height that's 4 by 6. So my width will be 4, and I'm going to type in IN for inches and 6 IN for inches, and it's going to translate into those picas for me. Once I have that set, I'm going to take my margins and set them at 0, because I don't need the margins right now. I can always go back and set them a little bit later on. I'm going to uncheck facing pages because what I'm creating doesn't need to be facing pages. It's just a single page, and I'll go ahead and say OK. That then gives me my 4 by 6 piece of paper to be working with. I want to move and take my units out of being in these picas into being in inches. So I'm going to right-click where the 2 rulers meet and change to inches. And there we go. Now I'm seeing it in inches rather than in picas. So at this point, it's about putting the frames on the page and starting to develop the content. And so to start this, I'm going to create a couple frames, and I want to walk you through how we can align those frames together. So I'm going to click on the frame tool on the left side here, and I'm going to go ahead and, for right now, I'll create 2 frames. And so the first frame here, we'll start up in this upper corner, and I'll create a frame it's about like that. I can also hold down Shift to keep it in proportions. Sometimes that's a good idea. Like that. Once I have this, I'll go ahead and copy it. Control C, Control V creates a copy. I could also go to Edit and then Paste. That would do it as well. And I'll drop that in. So I have those 2 pieces. Now, when I was moving these, you noticed that it kind of gave me some guidelines. Suddenly, I got some green lines that ran across. Furthermore, I got, no, it's not going to, there's a line there that turns pink and goes down the center of the page. Those are all active guides that InDesign has put in to help you align your work. In the old world of InDesign, before they put those guides in, you used to have to manually align all your pieces, and that was a lot more challenging. Now, basically, just dragging your object will help you do the alignments, and it makes your life a lot easier. I'm not going to worry about getting them too close. I'm going to leave them a little bit off because I'm going to show you another way of doing it. And I'm going to create a few more of these. So let me put another one in here. Put another one over here. Another one there. And another one there. Okay, so I wasn't perfect when I did the alignments. I could spend my time and get them perfect. But I want to show you the align tools. And so I'm going to switch my workspace into the advanced workspace. Oh, nice. It didn't give me the align tools. See if I don't think you guys, when you're in typography, see it. I think that was just something that I did. So with advanced, I'm going to go over to the window, and I'm going to choose to show the object and layout align toolbars. So it's going to go to window, object and layout, align. And that brings this little window up, which allows me to align my objects. And essentially what this does is if I were to take and select, I'll take these 3 objects. I'm holding down Shift and clicking on these 3 objects. I can use these align tools to align the 3 objects, essentially. Now, when I'm aligning the objects, InDesign needs to know which object needs to stay put and which objects need to be moved. And so in this case, if I wanted the top to stay put, I would click one more time on it. And it highlights in this blue color, meaning that's the key object. That's the one that everything else is going to move but this object. This one stays stationary. So it's selected as the key object. Now if I align to the left, you'll see that all of the objects now line up along the left side. So I could repeat the process here where I take these objects 1, 2, and 3, and I could say, OK, this will be my key object right here, and I want to align them all to the right. Okay, now they're all in alignment on the right. I could take that a step further using the Distribute Objects tools. And so if, for example, I had this object aligned already at the top, the spacing between these objects was off, and I had this object down at the bottom where I wanted to be. If I were to select these, 1, 2, and 3, and I use Distribute Objects along the center, it's going to move the middle object to be evenly spaced between the 2 outer objects. So it's not so noticeable here in a small context of elements. But if, for example, I had, let me move up here for just a second. Trying to create more to work with so you can see this work. OK, so I have six squares here. Right there, those 6 squares. If I were to select all of these and I were to use the Distribute Objects along the center, it's going to keep the first object and the last object in place, but it's going to evenly space the rest of the objects in between them. So it can be a very advantageous tool. The other option I have below that, so that was distributing objects. I can distribute spacing using a specific spacing. So right here, I'm saying use spacing at a 1/16 of an inch, 0.0625. And if I were to say distribute the spacing, it's going to keep all of the objects at exactly a 1/16 of an inch apart. So I have flexibility in terms of how these come together. I could also take those and I could align them all to the bottom so that we're nice and even, and suddenly I have a perfect row of 1-inch squares with the 1/16 inch in between them. Let me come back to this layout where I had these 6 cubes, and let's say that I wanted consistent spacing between them of a 1/4 of an inch. I could select these and I could say let's use spacing of 0.25 inches. And I want to distribute the spacing. Now they're at 0.25. That might have been a little bit too much, so let's try 1/8 of an inch, 0.125. And I'll distribute my spacing. OK, that looks pretty good. Now I could make sure that these 2 objects are aligned at the top. And I could, on these 2, I could use this as the key object, and I could align them. Or I could select this and say use spacing. I'll pick that as my key object. Let me use the spacing right there. And I think I already have it set. Yeah, they're already set, so it didn't move. And so now I have 1/8 of an inch between all of these objects on the page. Yeah?
Can you do the top and the bottom margins the same?
So on the top and the bottom margins, for example, I don't have a way, because I don't have an element on the top and the bottom. But there is a way of doing it, and I'll show you how to do it. No, it's good. It's a great question. So the question was, I have these 3 objects, but I want them to be evenly spaced top and the bottom of the page. If I want that, the best thing to do would be to group these objects together. So I'll select them, and I'm going to do them individually, though you could do the whole set at once. I will right-click once I have them selected, and I'll say Group, which creates one group out of these objects. And I can then drag these objects down until they snap to the center of the page. Now it's evenly spaced top and bottom. So once again, I would take these objects, group them, right-click, and say Group. It's also Control-G if you want to use the keyboard command for it. And I'll move that down until they match there. The other option, let me back up so that they're here again, ungrouped, would be to take all of the objects, group them, Control-G, and then drag them down, and you'll get a cross in both directions. So they're centered perfectly on the page in both directions. There they are, centered on the page with even margins around. OK? So now it's just a matter of I can start placing these objects in. I'm going to ungroup them, Shift Control-G, or right-click to ungroup, and then I can place my objects on the page. So I'll go to, with it selected, I'll go to File and then Place. And we'll go into today's folder. I think I have some images already downloaded. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and there's that object. I would select this, File, and then Place, and I could drop in that object. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and there they are. And you can start to see this build its way into being a page. Now what happens if I wanted to span these 2 frames? So at this point, I have two different options, and I'm going to show you one on each set at the bottom. So if I wanted to span these 2 frames, I could get rid of the first frame, and I could edit this one to go across, in which case my X gets bigger, and I could go to File and then Place, and I could drop in the image, right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. You could have all done that already. But what happens if I don't want, I want the image to span across, but I still want the white bar going between them? I can actually take this frame and connect them together, even though they're separate pieces. So let me take the first one here, and I'm going to do this multiple times. So once you see it happen, you'll be more interested in why. I can say this one plus this one. I'm going to go up to my Object menu. I'm going to go to Paths, and then Make Compound Path. It's Control-8. And you see that the X changes from being across one and across the other to being an X that spans across both. When that happens, I can then go to File and then Place. I'll drop in the same image this time. And I'll right-click and go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. And that same image now spans across both of these objects. So if, as I repeat myself again here, let's say that I had a bunch of little squares. OK, so I'm going to use those align tools. So we'll say that's my key object. Let's distribute. Whoops, that was going. Sorry. I have to do these in smaller groups first. There's my key object there. We'll distribute the spacing. Take this. Take these. There's my key object. We'll align to the top, and then we'll distribute the spacing there. We'll take these three. We'll align and distribute the spacing. We'll align and distribute the spacing. Oops. There it is. And let me move these over. Again, this is just an illustration of how it works. So I'm going to take this, plus this, plus this, those three, and I'll go to Object, Paths, Make Compound Path, and it's now going to span those 3 frames. I can go to File and then Place, and I can drop the image across those 3 frames. Fitting, fill frame proportionally, and now we're seeing it across those frames. I could take these 6 frames. I could go up to Object, Paths, Make Compound Path. It becomes 1. I can go to File and then Place. And right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. So any number of these frames, I can very easily join together, essentially, and have an image that spans across all the frames. So you can see how that starts to be rather flexible. What about if I don't want just the square? Well, it turns out any shape I draw, I can end up creating into a frame. So if, for example, I didn't want the rectangle, if I click and hold on the frame tool, you'll see there's an ellipse and a polygon frame tool. So if I did the ellipse frame tool, for example, I could draw an ellipse. If you want it to be a circle, you can hold down Shift and create your circle. And then I could go to File and then Place, and I could drop that image into the circle. Again, right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and there it is in the circle. If I wanted the polygon, I could switch to the Polygon tool, and I could draw the polygon. And I could fill that one, File, and then Place. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and there it is as a polygon. Truth is,
The numbers of sides you want.
somewhere I should be able to adjust the number of sides. And I haven't done it frequently enough because the truth is there's this thing called the pen tool, which we're going to spend a lot of time working on. But essentially, the pen tool will let you draw any shape you want. So let's say, for example, I wanted a shape that, go to the pen tool here, that was on a diagonal. Oh, sorry. That was like that, for example. I can use that shape to place an object. So I'll go to File and then Place. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. So essentially, anything I can draw, I could create. So if I can draw it with the pen tool. Now, you guys don't have a lot of practice with the pen tool just yet, but once you have some practice with it, you'll realize that you can draw almost any shape you want with the pen tool. And then you could place into that shape. Etc. So you get the idea of there's a lot of flexibility. So any object you can create that pen tool. I'm going to give myself a new page here because I've basically filled that page up. So you guys don't need to do multiple pages. I'm just adding another page because it's starting to get a little bit cluttered. OK, so let's say that instead I wanted to use some text as a frame. So I'll use the text tool. And let's give myself a text box. I'll use my last name as an example here. And I need to pick the font that I want. I'm picking something rather thick here. And then I need to up the size. OK, so there's my text. Well, the truth is the text can be converted into objects just like everything else that I've been doing. If I select my text, this is a one-way gate, though. So once you've converted it into objects, you can't go back and edit the checks. So if you made a spelling error, that's a problem. You have to go do it again. So I'll select the text. I'll go to the Type tool, and I'll select Create Outlines. And when I do that, it's converted from text into a bunch of shapes. Once I've created those shapes, I can go to File and then Place, and I can drop an image into the text. So again, another strategy for how you can create certain objects or certain shapes. All these techniques, by the way, I should have mentioned, are written out in InDesign 2.8, 2.9, 2.10, and the last one here, which I'm going to do, is about opacity. And so we'll go through this one in just a second. So if you want to adjust the opacity, if I select my object and I go to my Effects menu, you can see that there's an opacity slider. So let me give myself another object. Just try so that you guys can see this. And let me change the color. I'm not saying that this is an attractive composition. I'm just trying to show you how this stuff works, okay? So I have this object in front of that object. If I were to adjust the opacity here, say 50%, this is going to become transparent and show the green through, or show whatever it is behind. In some cases, you might want to not do it where it's all transparent, but it is a gradient from one sense to the other. It's very similar, like this. Let me double check. There's a little drop down here. I don't do this very often, so I have to double check on myself. There's a little drop down here with an FX on it for effects. If you want it to have a gradient feather, where it goes from one side being transparent to the other side being solid, you can click on gradient feather. This will then allow you to choose one side being solid, one side being transparent. If in this case it's linear, so it's going, the left will be solid, the right will be transparent, and my angle is set so that it's left to right. When I say OK, it's going to go from being solid on one side to being transparent on the other. So that's available in the Effects menu. Couple other things to point out. Just like in Photoshop, see Multiply, where's Overlay and Screen right there. Those are your blending modes. You can use them in InDesign just like you did in Photoshop. So if you have an object that has a white background and you want it to become transparent, you can use your blending modes just like you would in Photoshop. So I like to throw that out there because it's consistent across all the various options. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to let you guys play around with this. That's the goal, is to play around with it. You'll ultimately create your architecture postcard. If you have extra time, which I suspect you will, start working on your poster. Gives you a good leg up for that project. Remember, think about hierarchy, think about typography, what are your font sizes, etc. Make sense? Okay. If you run into a question where you don't know how to do something, let me know. We're going to cover multiple pages, masters, page numbers, and all that kind of thing next class, which you don't need for the poster anyway, but that's kind of the direction you're going. Dennis, did you have a question? Okay. Just checking. Any other questions? No? Okay.